Section O, hooked on the horn of plenty. So we looked in the last video, really the initial trigger of the Great Depression was when the stock market crashed on Black Tuesday. And that was due to the fact that Britain increased the interest rate on their loans. So we see a lot of people in Britain sell off their stock into the stock market to repay those loans because they figured this interest rate was too high to really make much money on the stock market. But this causes a panic. People start selling their stock, hoping to sell it before the price decreases. And we see on Black Tuesday about 16 million shares of stock are sold, really starting off the Great Depression. But really, this section talks about some kind of deeper issues United States government or United States economy was experiencing. Okay, so, what caused the Great Depression? Excellent question. Really, this depression is unique because it was caused by overproduction, both in farming and in factories. So we see farmers producing a surplus of goods, really lowering the price. Same thing with factories. People are manufacturing too many goods, and we see then a decrease in the price of goods. And so it was kind of ironic because this Great Depression, we had too much food, we had too many goods. The problem was just people didn't have the money to afford it. And the idea was a lot of people at this time, a lot of the wealth was among very few. So we had a lot of very, 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 very rich folks, but then the middle class, they were kind of pinched, so to speak. Remember when we shift the tax burden from the wealthy to the middle class, that furthered kind of the tightening of their budget, so to speak. So yes, we had lots of surplus of farm goods, we had surplus of manufactured goods, but everyday people really couldn't afford it. Along with that, we have this idea that a lot of people were buying on credit. Kind of think of QVC, Easy Pay, right? Buy it today, pay for it tomorrow. So people were getting deeper and deeper in debt because they were buying these newfangled inventions, kind of keeping up with the Joneses, but really they couldn't afford it. And we're seeing, some economic troubles overseas as well. This was not just a depression in the United States, but this was a financial collapse, more or less of the Western world. We see in 1931, this major bank chain in Vienna failed, so we see a lot of people overseas losing their life savings. Also, remember that Hawley-Smoot tariff that set the tariff rate at 60%. Well, that more or less dried up any international trade, or at least any trade between the United States and Europe, so that wasn't helping anyone else out. Also, we're seeing a lot of tensions are building because a lot of loan repayments are being are default. So we're seeing a lot of European nations having such a hard time economically that they cannot repay their war loans, and that causes a lot of tension in Europe, which is not a good thing, as we'll see. And also, coincidentally, in the 1930s, we see a horrible drought within the United States, specifically kind of in Mississippi. It hits it really, really hard. So we see a lot of farmers in this drought area, once again, defaulting on their loans. So they have to auction off their farms in repayment of the loans and sometimes in repayment of the debt. So we see a lot of farmers farming the same land, but instead of owning this land, now they're renting this land from creditors. So we see that shift happening as well. Not wonderful. And it's sad because a lot of Americans wanted to work. This is not a bunch of lazy Americans sitting around eating potato chips. A lot of people really wanted to work. But it's really, a lot of people lost their life savings through no fault of their own. I mean, they had their money in the bank and the bank failed. They just lost that money overnight. They weren't investing in risky, over-speculation investments or speculative investments. They weren't in the stock market. They simply had their money in a bank. The bank failed. They're out of luck, right? So we see, hard times are coming again. We see in most major cities there is something called a Hooverville. Thinking of Herbert Hoover, they named these villages after Hoover. And what they were, it's a collection of kind of just homeless folks who kind of throw together some sort of housing out of anything they could scavenge. So, boxes, old pieces of woods, these kind of shanty towns. So most major cities have something called a Hooverville, where the homeless kind of build their own little homes and, make the best out of the situation. All right. Section P, rugged times for rugged individuals. Okay. So President Hoover, I love him, right? He's from Iowa. I'm from Iowa. We just get along, right? Kindred spirits. But the poor guy, if you put pretty much anyone else in his place, they still would have had a real rough go at it, right? He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, So anyway, any president would have been overwhelmed, and it really hurt Hoover because in his heart he was really a humanitarian, right? He loved humanity, he wanted to help, but in his mind he had this idea that, Americans should be rugged individuals, right? You should pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And, he was a Republican, and that went right in line with Republican policy, saying that the government shouldn't be handing out money. That's not the role of the government, to save people during economic times. Remember, the role of the government to these Republicans, to Hoover, really was to, let the economic cycle be as it will. It'll correct itself over time, hands off. So there was a struggle even within Hoover himself, wanting to help out humanity, but at the same time thinking a direct handout would be un-American, and it would kind of deteriorate the democratic fiber of America as a country. So yeah, there's some tensions forming there. But after a while, once local city and local state governments started to run out of money to help, these poor folks, it really became clear that the depression is going to have to be, or the welfare of Americans suffering through depression would have to be an issue the federal government would have to face. So to us, it'd be obvious if there's a huge depression, the federal government's going to be doing something. But back in the day, this is a new step forward, you could say. Federal government assisting people directly? What? Crazy. Anyway, so Section Q will be talking about some steps Hoover takes to assist the economy at this time. So Hoover battles the Great Depression, Section Q. So the first thing he does is he recommends to Congress to start spending money building, on different public works projects. Public works being like building roads, bridges, parks, what have you, kind of the infrastructure. So he asked Congress to, start spending money, and we see Congress spend about $2.25 billion investing in these public works, because the idea is that you're creating jobs when you are building a road, when you are building a bridge. Most notably at this time, the biggest project by far is the Hoover Dam, right? The Hoover Dam is on the Colorado River. It's making this huge man-made lake to help control floods, for electrical power, for irrigation, all this sort of thing. So Hoover's making a small move forward. Okay, let's start spending money to help kind of bring about some jobs. Okay. Another idea he has, he establishes the RFC. The RFC stands for the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And what this does is the federal government giving out loans. But they're not giving out loans to individual people. No, this is the trickle-down economics coming to fruition once again. He's not going to give money to the guy on the bottom, the average Joe. He's going to give loans to banks, to railroads, to corporations. And the idea is by assisting the banks, assisting the railroads, assisting the corporations, that will naturally keep them stable, and that'll help everyone, on the bottom of the pyramid out as well. So still kind of trickle-down economics helping out the big boys. And the RFC, or the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, it kind of gets the nickname as the $1 billion soup kitchen. It does work. Okay, it does have some good impact, but really it's a little It's kind of too late, a little too late, okay? What's the phrase I'm looking for? Too little, too late. That's what I was trying to say. Okay. Also, we see passed in 32 something called the Norris-Laguardia Anti-Injunction Act. So more or less, this is kind of a helping pat on the back to unions that have been struggling throughout the 20s. And more or less, it's outlawing yellow dog contracts. Remember yellow dog contracts, if you were supposed to, if you're going to be hired to work in the Quaker oat factory, okay, you'd have to sign a contract saying, I will not join a union. So it's outlawing those yellow dog contracts, okay. Also what it's doing is it's forbidding federal courts from issuing injunctions to stop strikes and to stop peaceful picketing. So it is a small little pat on the back for the unions, which are more or less, devastated by the Depression, because everyone wants to keep a job. They're not demanding better pay. They're not demanding anything. They are just happy to get a job. But anyway, the Norris-Laguardia Anti-Injunction Act of 32. Okay, so here's the deal. Okay, Hoover, you're battling this Great Depression, but the hard thing is that the last 2 years he was in office, he was a Republican. And during that congressional election, we see a lot of the Republicans being kind of swept away. We see an increase in Democratic congressmen. So now we have Republican President Hoover trying to work with a Democratic Congress who more or less wants to see him burn. So it's, you hear a lot of times Hoover getting a bad rap, but really he was kind of a link. Okay, he's a link between the old school Republicans who thought do not touch the economic, system at all, to when we see kind of the next chapter, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his New Deal programs, which is definitely a very hands-on government approach to the economic system. So we really see Hoover's importance as he's kind of the link in the chain. He's the guy who's going to make that transition happen. These feeble steps forward, getting the government involved in the economics, that's really Hoover's role. He's kind of linking these two extremes together. All right, section R, routing the bonus army in Washington. Okay. Many veterans from World War I, just like the rest of the population, had been hit really hard during the Great Depression, or we see at the beginning of the Great Depression. So what they do is they decide that they want the bonus that was promised to them in I wrote that down wrong. They wanted the bonus that had been promised to them now. So what they do is there is a group called the BEF. Everything has an acronym, praise the Lord. The BEF, the Bonus Expeditionary Force. It's a group of World War I veterans that decide to gather in D.C., Washington, D.C. itself, and demand that Congress pass an act more or less giving them the bonus that was coming to them later on now. So we see about 20,000 World War I veterans and their families to some extent come to Washington, D.C. from all over the place. And their idea is we're not going to leave until we get the bonus. Well, Congress tries to work on some sort of legislation that would give them the bonus sooner, but once that legislation fails to pass, they're not going to get the bonus. We see Hoover actually step up and help, find transportation home, pay for transportation home for about 6,000 of these guys. But still, we have about 4,000, I should say, 4,000 of the, whatever. What am I even talking about? So we see Hoover arranged to pay the return fare of about 6,000 veterans, but still we have about 16,000 left who are refusing to decamp or refusing to leave because these soldiers had kind of built this huge Hooverville in the middle of Washington, D.C. So we see a couple riots break out in the camp, we see a couple people die, and the authorities in D.C., the police officers in D.C., finally, go to the president and actually ask for federal troops to step in to kind of disband this more or less kind of rowdy group of World War I veterans. Okay, so it's important to note Hoover himself charges what's called the bonus army of being, a bunch of riffraff and communists. But really, yes, there was a sprinkling of those, but really these guys were on the grand spectrum of things, definitely within their rights as Americans to be kind of protesting their lot in life. Anyway, so we see Hoover actually approve, federal troops breaking up this bonus army, but the actual eviction is a lot more severe than he really intended. We see a man by the name of General Douglas Macarthur. He will be back, World War II, here we come. Douglas Macarthur, he goes into this Hooverville, on horses, and they have bayonets, and they have tear gas, and they really just go through and just kind of this chaotic way, and just kind of evict people one by one. A young child dies, an 11-month-old child dies because of the tear gas. Just really this horrific thing, and it's definitely kind of a black mark against Hoover. Hoover was already pretty unpopular, but this, the straw that broke the camel's back. Everyone hates Hoover now. Look at these World War I veterans risking their lives for democracy, and this is how you treat them, tear gas and tyranny. It's just kind of a hot mess. Anyway, all right, section S. Japanese militarists attack China. Okay, so last two sections we're going to be talking real briefly about what's going on in foreign policy during this time. Okay. So, the Depression hit the United States, but the Depression is also lurking all over the world, really. So now that the world is kind of distracted by this Depression, Japan takes this opportunity to go into China and kind of take over Manchuria. Okay, Manchuria is a part of China. And when they go into there, they kind of nail the open door shut. So no one can trade with Manchuria. It's more or less Japan invading Manchuria and kind of claiming it as its own. Okay. So the question is, what are you going to do about it? Japan just totally openly, aggressively goes into China. What is the international community going to do about it? Well, we have the League of Nations, right? But the League of Nations isn't backed by the United States. So the League of Nations is very hesitant to make any moves without kind of speaking with at least the United States. So the United States response to this comes from the Secretary of State. His name is Henry Stimson. Okay, Henry Stimson produces something called the Stimson Doctrine, which more or less says, let me find it here, that the United States wouldn't recognize any territorial gains acquired by force. So this is the United States saying that, hey, if Japan, invades Manchuria, the United States as a country won't recognize Manchuria as being owned by Japan. And really, it's like, who cares? Big deal. Like, okay, you don't recognize it. It's really the United States saying that we're going to be fighting with words and not bullets. Today, if something similar happened, it would be an expectation perhaps that the United States would send troops in there, would, maybe through economic ways or some sort of active intervention, kick Japan out of China. But what the United States is saying is like, no, bad, shame on you, Japan, you shouldn't be doing this, but we're not going to take any active steps to, reverse your invasion. Yikes. Okay, so this is setting up a precedent. Japan is more or less now getting away with it. And Japan, adding insult to injury, China sets up a boycott of Japanese goods. There's kind of an unofficial boycott of Japanese kind of knickknacks in corner dime stores, but really none of these pressures really affect Japan at all. We even see Japan actually bombing Shanghai, which is of course in China. So really kind of getting away with murder while the, international community sits by and says shame on you. So it's really, if you wanted to say a start of World War II, some people might point to this incident saying because no one suppressed Japan's aggressive acts, it really cleared the way for other dictators of sorts to become aggressive within Europe and the world as well. Okay, Section T, it's a short section here. Section T, Hoover pioneers the good neighbor policy. So here's the deal. This section's talking about kind of the U.S. relations with the Caribbean or Caribbean and Latin American countries. And here's the deal. The United States, we're out of money a little bit, Great Depression, kind of a big deal. And also we're very, isolationists. We don't want to really get involved with any other countries, and that included Latin America. So we see during this time a lot of United States troops are pulled out of some of these troubled countries. We pull out our troops from Haiti in 1934. We do the same thing in Nicaragua. We've had troops there for 20 years. We pull troops out of Nicaragua, and the whole idea here is it's setting up something called the good neighbor policy. The idea that we're not going to be that interventionist nation that we were under, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. We're saying, kind of a hands-off approach. We're not going to be directly involved in their affairs anymore. Kind of paving the way to the next president, FDR, his further extension of this good neighbor policy, kind of leaving them alone. All right, so that's the end of chapter 32. Next chapter, we're going to continue to talk about the Great Depression, but more specifically, kind of the game plan of FDR, which is called the New Deal. So get excited.